Hey, I'm Nick, and in today's video I'm going to talk about some speaker stands that I built for my off-grid cabin, which has kind of a rustic modern theme. It's still kind of a construction project, but you know, like all projects, it's ongoing. So I wanted to build something that sort of mimicked the theme in here, and so I came up with these speaker stands. Maybe a little bit of wabi-sabi inspiration, and I used some stones that I brought home from a trip, some salvaged white oak, and I'm pretty happy with the way they turned out. And in this video, I'll talk a bit about how I made them. So here I got my two rocks, kind of cool pieces, very heavy, should make good base for some speaker stands. But I've got to figure out how to, make them level, or at least have them sit on something level, and then also how to attach some wood structure to them to create the speaker stand. So what I've done so far, I've cut these 1.25 by 1.25 square cherry blocks that are 1.5 inches long, and I've marked out roughly places on the underside of these rocks where I'm going to attach these blocks, and then these blocks will be used to both cushion the rock from the floor, but also to level it. So once these are in place, I can flip them over, cut the blocks off flush with a saw, and establish a level surface or a stable surface for the rocks to sit on. So I've marked them out. I'm going to match corresponding letters so I know which block is which. And then what I'm going to try to do is sort of cope or carve, or whatever you want to call it, these blocks so that they fit to the stone or to the rock, not super carefully. I don't need them to be, I don't even necessarily want a hairline crack, because I'm going to use epoxy to attach them. But I want them to have some level of fit to the irregular surface, so that I get as much epoxy contact as possible, and also just for looks. I don't want them to have, I don't want them to rock or to look, like big gaps. But that's the next step, and it'll be interesting to see how easily or how difficult it is to do that. And we'll see what happens. I'm probably also going to, once I start doing this, which I'll probably do by sort of tapping them against the rock and then flipping it over, seeing where the rock is hitting, carving that out, I'll probably have to tape the outlines of exactly where these are going to go. So I'll have to do something like this and say, okay, if this one's going here, I'll probably want to put a piece of tape to mark the edges of where it's going, so that I put it in the right spot. And also it may help to kind of keep the epoxy. It's going to be hard to mask off such an irregular surface, but it might keep some of the epoxy squeeze out from getting on the stone and make it easier to remove. So what I'm doing here is sort of whittling or grinding away the parts of these blocks where they touch the stone to sort of cope them to the stone. I'm using this rotary tool with a grinding burr on it to fit them. And then, it takes a little bit of time, a little tedious. Put it against the stone, smack it with a hammer, grind away the parts that are touching until you get a nice fit. And then I'm going to use this 5-minute gel epoxy to attach them, which is kind of a nice product because it works quickly. It's fairly thick, so it doesn't run all over the place, and it doesn't really need clamping. It probably actually works best with a little bit of buildup between the two surfaces. So yeah, we'll see if this works. Okay, well, I am about to set the last of the little blocks for the underside of these speaker bases. Probably took me maybe 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours to do all the little carving, coping, whatever you want to call it, on the underside of these. Wasn't too bad. And they're gonna have to set overnight to make sure that they are epoxy's fully set before I start messing with them. But what'll happen is I'll take them off or flip these upside down rather, and saw off the bottoms so that they sit flush or sit level. So that's pretty much it. Just kind of a waiting game at this point. One thing, you can see here, I've got this one. This is the last one I did. You want to peel the masking tape off before the epoxy sets fully. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to get off and probably stick to the block. So even with it still partially set, it's a little tricky to get off. But I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. Basically the way I had planned, which is always good. And I think it'll be a good solid base for these. I don't think that, given the size of them, there's no mechanical fasteners, but I think an 1¼ by 1¼ block has plenty of epoxy on it to keep it stable. So I'm making the columns for the speaker stands, and I'm making them out of some 8/4 white oak, and I want there to be a detail down the center of the column that, there's a gap there, a little bit of design interest. So after I initially milled the piece, ripped it down the middle to a 3/8 inch, ripping, and then I'm gluing it back together again, and then I'll mill it one more time to get it to its final dimension. And then what I built over here is a jig, which, was kind of something that I thought up. I think there's probably a lot of different ways that I could do this, but this is a jig that will allow me to hold the columns in a, plumb position while I work on coping the bottoms of them. So this was one way I could think of to do this. And yeah, we'll see how it all works out. So I've got the first speaker stand column in the jig. It's holding it plumb, and I'm gonna do the first step in starting to cope the bottom of it. It's gonna be a little bit more challenging than the smaller pieces. Probably take a bunch more work, but should work out okay. We'll see what happens. And probably require a little bit different tools. Probably bandsaw off the bottom at first, and then maybe use a heavier duty grinder until I've gotten more of the material removed, and then go to that smaller handheld battery operated grinder. This is something I don't think about a whole lot anymore, but many years ago, when I was just a little wee carpenter with a cheap pair of scribes, I bent the tip of it to make scribing against stone easier, and I've had these things for a long time now, and it's just a good simple way of getting a little bit more accurate scribe when you're against a very irregular surface. Trying a slightly different approach to what I did with the feet, and I'm using carbon paper to mark the bottom of the column for where it's touching the rock. Seems to be working really well so far. Gives me little black marks on the underside of the column where I know I need to grind more away. About an hour, maybe an hour and a half later, quite a bit of grinding and a little bit of carving, and I have what I think is a pretty acceptable cope. So moving on to the next step, which is to figure out how to epoxy a piece of all thread into both the stone and the column. Well, this project is definitely helping me get rid of my scrap plywood pile. So what I made here is kind of a little jig to hold the drill bit, the masonry drill bit that I'm going to use to drill a hole in the stone for a piece of all thread that I'm going to epoxy into it. You know, I want to be able to drill that hole as close as possible to plumb. So I made this little box that fits over it with a drill bit in it, and that's going to kind of guide me where I need to be. And then, you know, I've got my Hilti hammer drill here. You know, if it's not perfect, it's not the end of the world. I mean, part of the reason why I haven't trimmed the feet all the way is that I'm going to save trimming the feet for the very end. So even if the column ends up a little bit out of whack, I can still adjust it by trimming the feet. But, you know, I want it to be as close as possible. So we'll give it a shot. There's my piece of 5/16 all thread that's going to help hold the column in place. And, you know, I've got to obviously now drill a matching hole into the columns. So the next step is going to be trying to transfer the location of the hole in the stone to the underside of the column. And I had sort of a vague idea of how I wanted to do this. And I wish I could say that I planned it out so perfectly, but it just so happens that a 3/8 inch, I mean, it's a 3/8 inch hole, 3/8 inch countersink. I drilled the hole by accident, pretty much the exact right depth, so that the countersink just barely sticks up from the hole. So all I have to do is just put the column in position over top of it, give it a tap, and the point of the countersink is going to transfer a mark to the underside of the column. I made sort of an improvised jig here. Probably not my best work, but using a standalone drill press and just the assembly table and a block of wood to keep it square and, or well, plumb rather. And yeah, I mean, hastily improvised, but it seems to have worked. The moment of truth. I'll take that. It looks like it fits. And part of that, you know, I drilled a 3/8 inch hole with a 5/16 all thread. There's a little bit of play there so that when I do epoxy it, I can just make sure that I clamp it in place and get it where I want it to be. After coping away the bottoms of the columns where they touch the stone, I'm going to mortise and tenon the tops to receive the platform that the speaker is going to sit on. So where I'm at right now is setting up to start to cut for the tenon. So I'm going to cut the shoulders of the tenon. I've got the part marked out. And because the end of it is not straight, I can't really use the flip down stops on the fence to align it to make sure that it's, you know, that I get a shoulder that's cut evenly. So instead what I'm doing is using the rip fence and, you know, backing it off of the blade so that I'm not pinching the material between the rip fence and the blade. But, you know, what that does is it enables me to ensure that I get a consistent cut registered against the fence from the end. So that'll give me a nice clean shoulder all the way around. It's set at a 1/4 inch depth. And, you know, then I'll cut the cheeks off the tenons after I've established the shoulder. Now that I've got some very nice clean shoulder cuts made, it's time to set it up to cut the cheeks off. This is a kind of clumsy looking jig to tenon the cheeks, but it's just an adaptation of a jig that I already had. So rather than, since I've only got 8 cuts to make, rather than completely remaking this, I'd rather just use what I've got. So should work out just fine. I'm going to cut the through mortises on the tops for the speaker stand. So I've already kind of rough cut out the mortise with a jigsaw and the holes I drilled. I've made a flush cutting jig for a flush cutting bit, simply by just ripping pieces of plywood that are, you know, very much a tiny little bit smaller than what I want the mortise to be. So I'll flush cut that. And then once it's done, then I've just got a little bit of trimming to do with a chisel. I got a dry fit mock-up of the speaker stand right now. Just trying to make sure that everything works and that it looks good. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm putting a bevel on the underside of the platform. You know, I just think that I wanted something that looks, you know, proportional and in scale. The platform itself is 1 inch thick, but I want it to look like it has a little thinner of an edge. So to do that, I've just got, you know, I'm using the same sort of cobbled together jig that I was using earlier, and just putting the bevel on the table saw rather than trying to, you know, do it with the shaper or whatever. I mean, I would do that if I had a lot more pieces to work with, but in this case, it's just easy to set it up since I already have the jig. So one other just quick note, I mean, this is one of the things that's really nice about having a slider, but also I'm using a 0 clearance throat insert because you really don't want those little skinny pieces dropping back down into the blade and getting caught. Getting close to the moment of truth here. So got everything, I think, prepared to epoxy the columns to the stones. Got the stones masked off so that the epoxy doesn't get all over the place. And then I've got the threaded rods in the bottoms of the columns. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to epoxy those first with some epoxy that has a little bit longer pot life, like about 30 minutes, so that it stays flexible. I don't want those getting, you know, fixed into the wrong spot or in the wrong alignment. And then I will epoxy them to the stones. So yeah, hopefully it'll all go smoothly. All right, well, put a coat of finish on these yesterday, as well as did all the epoxy work. So really, other than maybe another coat of finish, the only thing that's really left is to finish trimming the feet. So I sort of purposely left the feet longer than they needed to be so that I could come back and, make any corrections that I would need to make to get the top of the stand to sit level, knowing that there was going to be probably some play in it when I did the epoxy work. So I've already trimmed this one and pretty happy with the way it turned out. And, call it luck, I don't know, but it's pretty good. So I'm happy with that. And what I'll do is I'll use a little shim, in this case, a little piece of 1/4 inch, to trim off all 4 of those. And then I'll use a piece of sandpaper to just make any minor corrections on the bottom that need to be made.